The Flintstones and the Jetsons, issue 19. George wants Elroy to clean his room and takes away his comic, and when Elroy asks why Rosie can't clean his room, he says the last time they sent her here, somehow all of her logic circuits burnt out. We see the next day, where Judy's annoyed at Elroy making faces, a day later where he's singing loudly in front of Jane for some reason, and the next day where he's playing video games late into the night. And then he plays toy gun tag with his friend in a spacesuit and a lava lamp gets knocked over. It's a future, so it could make sense that they could have a comeback. Just as I was about to call his behavior out of character compared to the show, George says he's usually well behaved. So I hope this means it'll be explained why he's acting inexplicably annoying. My hope for that nearly vanishes when George gets a call from his teacher who says Elroy's been selected to be an exchange student with a kid from another planet for a short time. Jane doesn't like this, and I wonder if it's remotely realistic for this to happen with no warning without approval from the parents. His parents hope staying with people from another culture will be good for Elroy. This makes me wonder if the opposite will happen. When before I was thinking that he'd go to a family with much stricter discipline and come back really polite. A week later, Judy makes a joke as if the idea of Elroy behaving is ridiculous, and he walks onto the spaceship staircase completely unaccompanied by his parents. Jane cries, and so does Astro because Elroy left. Elroy's told by a device on his lap on the way to the other planet that everything on planet Weirdo is the opposite of Earth. This is the kind of thing that's both constantly interesting and forced enough to make me stop caring about the place. There's no way awful birthday cake would be served every day that's not someone's birthday because people would get tired of it. Although if everything's the opposite, then if they're saying it's awful, that means they think it's good. But then why would they say yum? And there's also no way the cops would lock themselves up when they catch someone else breaking the law, as society couldn't function like that. But it is worth it to see such a funny panel. Don't let us catch you again, or we'll be forced to go to jail too. It's also forced that the thief who went through all the trouble of getting the money would give it to the cop with a smile for no reason. There's no reason everyone who makes a report at a desk would tear it to shreds, because then no work would get done, and the whole world wouldn't work. So these employees certainly wouldn't be getting a raise, or even get paid. And there's no reason a parent would be proud of her kid for getting nothing but F's. Because it'd mean no college would trust him because the colleges would be wasting their time if they were trying to teach F students who'd have no job prospects. And it wouldn't make sense for people to be encouraged to get nothing but F's because it'd be training them to not even try at their jobs. Good for Elroy that he thinks this will be fun because it keeps him in a good mood. Meanwhile, the replacement for Elroy, Yorley, talks in the opposite way that he would. It's so unlikely that he'd be dressed so similarly to Elroy, but it's still possible. He's shocked that their home's clean and makes it messy to try to help. But if his society is the opposite, won't he not try to help? I guess he thinks because this place is the opposite, trying to help would get him rewarded instead of punished. Then Rosie threatens to give him a spanking, but it won't even work as karma because somehow he's gonna love it. There's no way a species would evolve to enjoy pain because that'd mean they'd have all gotten themselves killed trying to constantly seek it out. I'm sure this was a very fun story for the writer to write, and I can't get enough of it. So ultimately I can't honestly say this is a bad story because there's so much variety in it to take full advantage of this. What are the chances that Yorley's parents would look similar to Elroy's parents even a little? But again, it's possible, so I'll forgive it even though it shouldn't be the case. Elroy's happy at being told to throw his clothes on the floor before they could have dinner. She has to mean all of his clothes except his undergarments. There's no way he would be comfortable with following this rule. She has to mean throw the clothes that are in his briefcase. So I wish I saw that to clear this up. But this is an opposite that's believable because it could just be considered a way of making yourself more comfortable because you're at home. Like taking your shoes off when you go inside. He wonders if his room is really the other way, and ends up falling a little because there's no stairs. and somehow he's told to bring in the garbage even though the people on this planet would hate the smell, because there'd be an advantage to evolving to hate the smell of the stuff we consider to be garbage. We have to get rid of it for good reason. There's bacteria on it. Unless in this world, all the bacteria and flies and bugs are actually good for people. And somehow, Elroy still doesn't get by now that he has to say goodbye to great people. All of the kids are misbehaving, and there's just no way they'd be allowed to because it'd be impossible for the teacher to teach them. And if this society doesn't value kids actually getting good grades, then why does it even have schools instead of sending them to work right away, which would really be the opposite? At least I find it fun to point out why none of this makes sense. This is at least bad in the early Pander style instead of being boring. Elroy gets lied to by the kids who are smiling to indicate that. But if this was really the opposite world, they wouldn't be smiling to indicate happiness. I still don't like the dialogue. The teacher somehow thinks that the easy math is advanced, even though there'd be no advantage to that either. Elroy somehow thinks he has to try hard to get the right answers. So the teacher punishes Elroy by hitting himself. At least that can make sense, because the idea is the student's supposed to feel bad for him. But teachers would have gone on strike to make that something they don't have to do anymore. And it'd work about as well as the whipping boy idea in Ancient Royalty, where it'd only teach them to stop having empathy. And if it was really the opposite, then the correct answers to the math problems would be wrong. It's so annoying that Elroy's forced to be too dense to immediately adapt when there's no reason for it. The people in the lunchroom are getting served garbage, which they're happy about. This can at least make sense because they're aliens, so their biology is different. No wonder Elroy was told to take in the garbage. Then why was it ever taken out? Maybe the garbage trucks put garbage in the cans. And if they're only calling it garbage to be opposites, why do they call anything by the right name? Why is Elroy trying to do homework when he should know he's not supposed to here? So his substitute dad is somehow scolding him for not having the stereo blaring loud, even though he'd rather be able to hear his TV or focus on his book. I could at least understand him not wanting him to do homework because he would rather him have fun, because that's compassionate. He also has no reason to complain that he's not jumping on the bed making noise, because then he wouldn't hear his TV either. He takes away his homework, and somehow decides that giving him a raise and allowance is a punishment. When obviously this would just give kids an incentive to keep this up, because more money means getting more of what you want. There's no way that less money would mean getting more of what you want. And again, if this was supposed to be a punishment by making you feel bad for your parents, no kid is gonna feel bad for their parents for giving them more money for their allowance. It's not like it's $1 million more, I mean. I really don't like the George subplot. I just feel bad for him having to see such a messy room. There's no way his culture would want fire on the blankets of their beds, because that'd be lethal pretty fast. It's not like they're immune to fire. Even if they were, the fire would still spread to the rest of the building and destroy it. I wonder if George will get a clue and figure out how to punish him. Thankfully he does pretty quickly. So what took him so long? This didn't even have to be an entire subplot. It could have just been a few panels. He decides to punish him by getting Rosie to give him a lot of treats. To be fair, because he's an alien, it could make sense that he'd see those treats as a punishment because he could hate how they taste. But if he lives in an opposite world, wouldn't he want to hate what he tastes? So he agrees to behave, and Elroy doesn't know where he left the book, which justifies him deciding to clean up his room. He gets told off for it, even though a clean room is easy to vacuum in, and a dusty room can result in the dust getting in someone's lungs and making them cough after a long while. And she also wouldn't want a sticky mess like soda to stay on the floor and have him step in it and stain his socks. But they could easily avoid that. Maybe in this planet, dust doesn't do anything harmful to people, if they even have it. But still, it'd be good to have a clean room if it means you know where everything is. so she'd see the advantage. Not scold him for having a room where there's tons of room to walk on the floor on. He's told off for making the mother laugh, and the father reassures her. Sadly, it skips ahead in time to Elroy on a conveyor belt in the process of leaving the family. It's too bad we never got to see him get rewarded. You'd think he'd love it with them because they'd be rewarding him for the behavior he had at the start. But instead he conveniently started behaving just because he was sent there, even though he'd know he'd actually be rewarded for his misbehavior over there. And he's supposed to be a genius. He runs over to George happy to see him again and gets picked up. And he promises to never misbehave again. George calls him a good boy even though he wasn't at the start. And he hugs George while Jane pets him. The story ends with a surprisingly sweet final panel considering how the dialogue is. The Flintstones and the Jetsons, issue 20. Elroy throws an anti-gravity stick that moves in a zigzag a few times, so Astro chases it and jumps into an open rocket and gets blasted off, like what already happened to him and Elroy. Elroy thinks he was gone a long time, and he sees him come back holding a little satellite in his mouth. So the comedy page ends with me concluding that in this universe he's a robot, because he didn't die from being sent to a place without air. Even if the planet did have an extended atmosphere, that would mean there'd be a lethal amount of oxygen next to the surface. And now for the actual story. Judy has a shocking temper by throwing something at her dog for shedding on her dress. But Astro had no excuse for doing that when he's constantly shown to have the same level of intelligence as a human, even if it's downplayed compared to the show. If Judy was mad at him for chewing up her dress, it'd make more sense. But she's not. Why does she say it's ruined when it should be very possible to get rid of the hair on it? Especially in the future. Can't she shake it off? George refuses to let her replicate a new dress because last month's matter bill was too much. Judy is shockingly sexist for a girl of the future, saying that if she grows up to be strange, it's only because she doesn't have a dress tonight, even though it's just for one night. He tells her to wear pants for a change. She says no girls wear pants anymore. We don't know what the future holds for fashion, so whatever. It's just hard to believe that because you'd think that would mean feminism took a downturn in the future. She doesn't like having nothing to do at night, but reads a book on her laptop. So she gets an idea. George is shocked at her planning to leave the house wearing a dress made out of blinds. It looks ridiculous, but again, we don't know what future fashion's gonna be like, and sometimes the fashion of the past looks ridiculous to us, so maybe this isn't forced. It'd be common sense of her to use curtains instead of blinds, so I have to assume she didn't have curtains. It's nice of her boyfriend to compliment her dress. She bravely goes on the date despite her father forbidding her, so he must not be disciplining her enough, or right. So clearly Rosie thinks she's too old to get punished the old-fashioned way. She thanks her boyfriend and dances at a club, where you see that rather than her actually wearing a dress made of blinds, she's just covering the back and front of her clothes with them, which isn't too bad. The bouncer at the club tells an old lady to take off because only good-looking people belong there. That won't be the case because the club won't make as much money, unless the club owner is a complete idiot. He's told she's the editor of a fashion magazine, and conveniently he believes her without any proof. She sadistically says this whole place is over if he messes up again, even though I get the impression that if he didn't recognize her, no one would. So she shouldn't be blaming him. Predictably, she thinks Judy's outfit is the next big thing, even though she's the only one like that. Despite the fact that she thought she was spaced out when she saw it, she still thinks Judy's a genius just because she made a weird new outfit herself. So she'd think Harper from Wizards of Waverly Place is a genius. She offers to make Judy a fashion mogul, and plans to have that dressed in every store in the country and debut her new line of evening wear later. Because this is a sitcom, so more convenient stuff happens. The next morning, George wants to punish her. Apparently because she has stacks of money all over her floor that she's keeping to herself. But he doesn't explain that. She tells her sketchpad to give her more of a red color and complains that she's on a time crunch for designing dresses. She tells George she's too busy for being grounded and bribes him to let her use the matter converter. George is insecure because his daughter has become more successful than him, which is understandable if uncommon. Jane's written to talk in big words in a barely understandable way, which is pretty forced, and she thankfully shows sympathy for George instead of just being mean to him, which is a relief compared to the comics where she was a jerk. We see a fashion model wearing a costume that everyone laughs at, and the laughter continues for all of the outfits made of objects. I always assumed that Judy would be making regular dresses. Sure, that Blind's dress got her famous in the first place, but it was obvious that she just got lucky the first time, and her manager should have known that too. If I was her, I would have just asked the designer if she wanted regular dresses or dresses made of crazy objects. Sure, it looks arbitrary that people laughed at these dresses and not the Blind's dress, but fashion is arbitrary in real life too. I wish I was shown a future or alternate dimension where she did make it as a fashion designer. Thankfully, George says he's put all of Judy's money away for college, so she's really gonna get something out of this to make it all worth it. But I never had the impression that he didn't already have a college fund for her, so it still feels really underwhelming compared to ending the story with her going to a roller coaster or something. But I'm glad the story doesn't end with her losing all of the money for some reason or having already wasted it all. And it makes sense that he wouldn't have a college fund if Spacely's a jerk, so he would have barely given him any money. The story ends with her upset that she stupidly threw out all of her old clothes from arrogantly assuming that her stupid new outfits would be considered okay. The Flintstones and the Jetsons, issue 21. Elroy tells George he knows why the treadmill is stalling and speeding up, while he's invested in watching a TV show about monster trucks. He calls Elroy a good boy, and Elroy seems to fix the conveyor belt. I wonder if he'll somehow fail even though he thought he could do it. Because the show gets interrupted by a news bulletin, George runs off to get a snack as the news says their galaxy is about to experience something that only rarely happens called the cosmic equinox. While I look forward to making the story interesting, I don't take it very seriously because not only does it seem like some out of nowhere supernatural stuff, but I'm wondering why there would ever be a news bulletin about it that isn't gonna tell people what it is. Instead, it's already over, with the guy calling the TV that usually plays mindless when that doesn't usually happen. Maybe he wants to get fired from people overreacting. Elroy tells George the news and gets no response as he only wants to cheer on his favorite wrestler when he can't hear him. Thankfully, he conveniently doesn't get his feelings hurt by his father not caring about what he had to say again. And instead he looks forward to charting out the stars tonight, because apparently he's the kind of nerd who wants to waste time doing that for no reason, even though the astronomers would have already done that. After dinner, George is worried about having to do a big presentation, and Jane reassures him that he'll do fine. She makes the story less believable if she actually means that she has a funny feeling he'll be fine just because of the cosmic equinox. He thanks and kisses her, and George calls Elroy a genius for fixing his dog walker. Why did he take so long to learn this? I think the story could have started here, and we'd miss nothing. Elroy wonders what the cavemen thought of the stars. Sadly, this wastes my time with a completely unrelated Flintstone subplot that is no excuse for not being a separate story as a result. Anyways, I'm disappointed when the conveyor belt speeds up anyways for no reason at all, despite the fact that Elroy would only think he could fix it if he was good at fixing. He fixed Rudy, some repetition wastes some comic space, and then Fred, Barney, and his pets crash into George and show up in front of Jane in one of the most forced excuses for a crossover ever. I wish it was explained that the cosmic equinox is related to witchcraft, because it'd be right at home in one of the Sabrina stories. While it'd still be arbitrary that it happens and what effect it has, at least I know why this is possible. Rosie reassures Jane that she shut off the conveyor belt, and Jane's relieved and asks her family if they're okay. At least this explanation for the meeting doesn't imply that the Flintstones really is millions of years ago. And as usual, there's no explanation for why the cavemen speak the same language as them if we are supposed to believe they're from millions of years ago. And somehow, Judy asks them what they did with her family, as if he got rid of them on purpose. Judy feels bad for his pets and wants to help, so Jane invites them in. And out of nowhere, it turns out this comic took place in 2099 the whole time. Meanwhile, George is stuck driving Fred's car, and he doesn't know how to stop it because it's not a space car. But everyone knows Fred's car only goes forwards because he moves its feet along the ground. Another reason the show is dumb, because the car would be too heavy for that. So the car going here would only make sense if it still had an engine to send it moving ahead on its own. And so the only reason there is a hole for the feet is to encourage people to get some exercise. Maybe they're too dumb to realize that it's not doing anything for the car. A traffic cop badgers George into showing him his license. He doesn't believe him, and somehow he calls him Flintstone for no reason, after getting him and Elroy to Fred's house just because the car was registered to Fred, when he could have easily thought he stole his car. What, does he think Barney made a device that changed the way Fred and someone else looked? This could have so easily not happened. It would have clearly been better if he had just happened to stop the car near Fred's house. Even if it'd be a coincidence, it could have run out of gas. He talks to Wilma and tells her the truth, out of complete desperation, since clearly there's no way these cavemen could bring him home. Elroy tells George the obvious that he better have already figured out. Why does he think he didn't know that already? I love that Fred says he could get used to this, as some floating little devices are spraying his feet and ankles. Barney was inventor from the beginning, so you'd think if he was so smart, and even had a modern culture, he would have already invented these things for him. Barney's the good-hearted one because he only cares about how worried his family would be about them. Naturally, Fred thinks that because this is the future, they've probably got experts working on it and they'll get home in no time. Out of desperation, Jane turns to Henry for an explanation. Jane says George was counting on doing his presentation for a promotion, and surprisingly, Fred offers to help out for no apparent reason. Maybe it's to suck up to these nice future people for his own benefit, when it should be clear that he'd be way out of his depth with George's job, and he'd just get in trouble instead. He plans to lie that he's George's cousin filling in for him while he's got the flu. The fact that Barney doesn't trust his plan only makes me really annoyed that he's gonna go through with it anyways. So I wish he had a partner that didn't give away that his plan would fail every time. Archie and Jughead's dynamic is better, because while Jughead doubts that Archie would actually succeed, Archie can either bribe him into going along with it with burgers, or he can outright wrestle him into going with them. But he doesn't do either. I guess Jane only trusts them out of desperation. She tells Judy to pick out better clothes for them, and Rosie to give Fred a holo program of George's presentation. They should explain that they think he'll get fired if they don't send Fred as his replacement, because then it'd be a lot stronger of an explanation instead of an idiot plot. Jane thanks Fred, who grabs an inexcusable idiot ball again by planning to say stuff that wasn't in George's script, taking an unacceptable risk with nothing to gain from it. Barney knows that's stupid too, and somehow he didn't already think of a good last name for Barney, so he comes up with a stupid one. I guess the reason the receptionist doesn't question it is out of politeness, and from knowing that there's plenty of silly sounding last names in real life. In fact, Spacely already knows someone with the last name he's got from an unlikely coincidence. Fred says he'll present Spacely with George's idea, and thankfully the story cuts past it a few minutes ahead, because I didn't want to see the nerve-wracking presentation. Spacely loves it in a twist, and gets thanked. Though it's only a twist in the sense that it's a Captain Obvious twist, because you might be hoping otherwise, because this just rips off the movie. He's also surprisingly smart enough to ask if these are all George's ideas, or if he added something here and there. And by smart, I mean plot convenience, because I don't think he would have asked that of someone who's only meant to fill in for someone who knows the job. Barney being written to tell Fred to be careful makes it unacceptable that he somehow said he added something anyways. Because it should be obvious that whatever job he'd get offered, he wouldn't be good at. Barney does nothing but make the plot unbearable. At least if he wasn't there, I could forgive Fred's risk-taking as I'm not knowing any better. I'm not missing anything by ignoring their stories. So of course, Paisley plans to jump at the lame excuse to fire George and make Fred his new director of marketing. Which is weird because before, we were given the explanation that the reason he didn't fire George was that he liked having someone pathetic and stupid to yell at. And he doesn't have any replacement. George suffers, and Elroy hopes he made a time machine right. So now that he's stuck in the past, he's desperate enough to make one despite thinking it was impossible before. In an overly padded out scene, Astro gets made to test it and it just teleports him outside. I don't really believe this because he already thought it could make a time machine in the first place. So how did he screw up like this? I know time and space are part of the same fabric, but still. He says the parts he needs haven't been invented yet. Invent them! Why did he even bother then? George misses his family and they hear a beeping from Elroy's constellator being used as a rattle. He thanks Pebbles, and he looks up at the sky and finds out they have one more day before the stars move out of alignment. Not that this is necessary. And what they really mean is the planet moves. The stars aren't moving. He somehow needs to ask George what they were doing the moment they switch places in time. I don't understand what caused them to switch places with those exact people and not other people. They aren't related. Speaking of related, it's kinda lame that Fred doesn't meet Ferd. They're told what switched Fred, and he says their feet triggered the time warp, and so they of course need to make it happen again in reverse. Why didn't they ask this question a lot earlier? The plot could have been a lot shorter. Fred misses his wife for no reason, and Judy decides to take him to a museum exhibit of cavemen to make him feel better. She sees a new exhibit, a letter to them from Elroy that explains how to reverse the time switch. By the way, it could have easily been that the letter wouldn't have survived that long. Henry says he rigged the conveyor belt to go backwards, and Fred thanks Jane for everything she did for him, and she thanks him again redundantly. I feel like a plot thread isn't being resolved if she isn't calling him out on stealing George's job. George drives the car back, and a bunch of space is wasted on boredom before things go back to normal. So of course the families are happy to see them again and hug, and a text box says everything's back to normal. I can't believe the story ends without explaining how George avoids being fired. Why even write Fred to get his job then? This story was about Elroy being sent to another planet by the foreign exchange student program where almost everything is the opposite. And it was fun explaining how practically nothing made sense. Because it wasn't anything like Earth, so it felt creative. Things are the way they are for a reason. I don't like that the story got conflict out of the characters somehow being too dense to instantly realize they should be doing the opposite of the usual to deal with the situation. I couldn't stand George's subplot. It was predictable and unnecessary. And it didn't make sense that Elroy went from being uncharacteristically bratty with no explanation for its being well behaved just because he was sent to another family, because he was told that everything was the opposite over there. So he would have been given treats as a punishment, at least at first, until they'd instantly figure out how to punish him. But somehow that didn't happen. Good, the story was depressing enough for him. The story makes no sense, but I don't feel like it was bad because it was always entertaining. Although I'll admit, it doesn't take any effort to come up with what's the opposite of something over and over again. But it's still interesting to watch at least. It's not a plot that's usually done. This story is about Judy deciding to go out covered by her blinds because George forbid her from making herself a new dress with a replicator to save money. I guess he means save money on the electric bill. Nobody laughs at her because the future of fashion is weird, and then a very unlikely coincidence happens as a fashion designer hires her to make clothes. I'm happy for her for making all that money in advance before anyone knew her outfits. Which all sucks because either naive arrogance made her think everyone would adore them after the first one lucked out, or a manager forced her to make outfits like that instead of regular outfits, and then didn't own up to it in the end. I expected regular outfits at first because that'd be common sense. I feel so bad for her in the end. Good thing her money was put towards something valuable instead of being taken away or wasted. I didn't hate going through the story, as unlikely as it was. because I appreciated that it stayed lighthearted until the end. This story is a pathetic excuse for a Flintstones crossover since there's no reason an alignment of the stars would cause Fred and Barney to switch with George and Elroy, and no reason they could switch back either. I get wanting to be creative instead of doing the same thing the show's crossover did to explain the crossover, but it was stupid and the plot doesn't explain that witchcraft is really involved in this. And the plot doesn't do much to be original anyways when Fred gets George's promotion, because he got his job in the crossover too. So it's just lazy. It was okay to go through, but there wasn't nearly as much focus on the cool technology of the future to keep it interesting throughout, with only one panel showing you Fred liking the future. So by missing the point of a Jetsons story, it was kind of a boring, pointless, and overly long, redundant story considering how basic the plot was. It should have explained that witches are responsible for the cosmic equinox. At least I would be trying, because expecting me to believe it's scientific is even less believable. It was insulting. I know you wouldn't expect witches to be a part of the Flintstones, but you wouldn't expect the Great Gazoo to be a part of the Flintstones either. So maybe the Great Gazoo should have been responsible for this, because they have supernatural stuff. It's just completely pointless. At least it's better than the movie in that it doesn't have Fred trying to drop Barney to his death. It's too bad this is the last Jetson comic ever made. There wasn't a single actual continuation of the franchise after this, aside from the movies that I'm not impressed by. You'll never see these characters again, and I certainly wouldn't want to read anything that just has the Jetsons name without being what people like the Jetsons want. Like a comic that pretend to carry on the legacy of the series but refuse to keep the art style because it has no respect for the series. Is it no wonder that's only had 6 issues despite the series being popular and well known? With a generic art style like that, everyone would assume it's not enough like the Jetsons because of the sheer audacity of it. Because if it thinks it knows so much better than it, then why trust it in the first place? It's just gonna make mistakes the original series never did, especially if it follows the trend of modern comics of being too dark. So I bet it's dark and edgy. And by making Rosie skinny, it's implying that they think you have to be skinny to look like a woman.